What up, motherfuckers? It's the hater back again up in this bitch. You know what I'm saying? Hater mania running wild on all your bitch asses. What do you think of that? So today we're going to talk about something that I alluded to in my Royal Rumble review video, and that is the lack of main event caliber champions for WrestleMania, right? So here's how WrestleMania works, guys, right? You have one person who is the champion, right? This person has typically been built up for a long, long time as a credible champion, right? Then you have them at WrestleMania as the champion, defending their title against someone who has equally been built up in anticipation for this match. Do you see what I'm saying? You see what I'm getting at here? This is the traditional formula for wrestling main events, right? You could see this happening as recently as Ronda Rousey, right? Ronda Rousey was built as a champion, right? She was undefeated, as far as I know, right? She was out there dominating these broads left and right, and she became Raw Women's Champ, right? Then on the other side, you had Becky Lynch, right? Becky Lynch had an incredible year for her career, and she was built as a big deal. In many ways, during the Survivor Series build-up for this feud, she was billed as the star of SmackDown, as the number one of SmackDown. You understand what I'm saying? She wasn't like, you know, the number one woman. She was the leader of the SmackDown locker room. This is how you justify a WrestleMania main event. Now, we know that that main event is probably the worst main event of all time, so that's not even a great example, right? And in that main event, they also had to interject Charlotte because they probably feared that one title and these two women were just not enough. You know, it's better to have three women in the main event because then you can say three women have main event at WrestleMania, right? There's a lot of complications in that. Let's look at another feud, right? John Bradshaw Layfield, one of the greatest champions in the history of SmackDown, right? He's out there champion for like the longest time ever, right? He broke the record back in the day, in the modern era. Then you have Cena, who started off that WrestleMania, the one before, as US champion, beating Big Show, finally becoming an established superstar. Then throughout that year, he's feuding with people like Booker T, right? And then eventually Carlito, you know what I'm saying? And in that, he establishes himself not only as a face, but as a winner, right? He was a long-reigning US champion, all things considered, right? Sure, his reigns were not exactly super long themselves, but his presence in the United States title picture and him being screwed out of it several times by Orlando Jordan, kind of by Booker T, and by Carlito, not really screwed, but, you know, he lost that one, you know what I'm saying? And then he went and he won a number one contenders tournament after being the second guy left in the Royal Rumble, second to Batista, right? Who was on a similar trajectory, right? And even way before, when JBL was announced as the number one contender to Eddie Guerrero's title, John Cena was right there with him, right? The feud was long, and John Cena felt like he was ready to be in the main event, right? Because he was pushed severely during that year. That's what it takes to be a WrestleMania main eventer. You understand? You see what I'm saying, motherfuckers, right? This is the same thing you could argue with Daniel Bryan to an extent, right? Jericho and Triple H to a lesser extent. A lot of WrestleMania main events have had this element, right? And if they haven't, they've been the secondary title, right? So Eddie Guerrero versus Kurt Angle, they're both established, but you could make the argument that Eddie Guerrero was not an established main eventer at the time, right? That's why he didn't close the show, motherfuckers, because other more established guys had to go in front. Now, all of this is predicated clearly upon two elements, right? A WrestleMania-worthy champion, that means someone that goes to WrestleMania as a champion, right? This can't be just your runaway jobber, right? And a champion that either is an established main eventer or someone that has been built in that year to be a credible champion. You can do this in various ways. You can have them be champion for a long time, you can have them win, but they have to have something there, right? People either have to love them or they have to hate them. That's why the classic formula of WrestleMania is good guy finally beats bad guy. This is the formula that works best, right? JBL was over, but a lot of people didn't like him, right? Some of them didn't like him because he was Bradshaw in the APA and they thought he was a jobber. And some didn't like him because he did very effective heel work, right? But for whatever reason, they didn't like him and they loved Cena. This is why this was a good, quote-unquote, main event. You understand me? Right? Rey Mysterio, same thing. When he made it to WrestleMania, they had to put in Randy Orton because they were afraid that Rey Mysterio might not get it done himself, right? But Rey Mysterio was built up very well. He won the Royal Rumble at number 1, first of all, right? Or number 2, I should say. Secondly, he was getting that push after Eddie Guerrero's death. I mean, it is what it is, but that's what happened, you know what I mean? So, where do we find ourselves this year and the year before? Last year and the year before that, and even the year before that, we found ourselves in a different scenario, right? I might even argue that the last real WrestleMania main event, right, was Cena versus Rock. Back in the day, motherfuckers, back in New Jersey, you understand me? Because that had 2 established guys. You had super established John Cena as the challenger, and you had The Rock, who re-established himself by being champion, but also who is a legendary wrestler, right? So that felt like a main event. It's like, oh my God, this is a main event. That mainstream people that don't watch wrestling were interested in that. And the one before when they wrestled, right? The only thing was this was the second one, so it didn't really feel as good, right? Before that, it's like Taker, Shawn Michaels, right? You had to have these established guys. Recently, WWE has shifted their strategy, right? Their strategy no longer is predicated upon having basically 2 of these guys in the main event. They have 1 of these guys in the main event, and they're not trying to build any new stars, right? Because, and I don't blame them, right? When they make a new star, the star leaves and starts hosting like Wipeout or whatever the hell John Cena's hosting this week, you know? Or goes to Hollywood like Cena and Batista even, and The Rock obviously did, right? So you don't want to build up these stars, right? Because out of, let's say you take 10 people, 8 of them will leave you for something better, right? 8 of them will leave you. The Triple H's, the people that are invested in the company, familially speaking, and the Undertakers who are super loyal, and Kane and people like that, Mark Henry, the really loyal ones will stay. Also, let's be real. It's not like people are offering Mark Henry movie roles, right? Or offering Sheamus and Undertaker movie roles. You know, they don't have that aesthetic, if you will, right? But someone like Randy Orton, for example, sure as shit Randy Orton could transition into Hollywood, right? He's a good-looking guy. He's young, right? He's strong-looking. Right, he's tall. He's got elements of that, right? But for whatever reason, maybe his problems, who knows, right? Or maybe he didn't want to. I don't know. I don't really care, right? So the shift has now been to rely a lot on old people, right? On part-timers, as we call them. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, right? If the other side of the equation fits, right? So, for example, Brock Lesnar has main evented the last 1,000 WrestleManias, right? And each one of those WrestleManias, Brock Lesnar is there with one purpose: to most likely lose, and to establish someone else as the new guy, right? Taking out of the equation the WrestleMania, I think WrestleMania 30, where Randy Orton cashed in, Seth Rollins cashed in, that one doesn't count because the real main event, like Seth Rollins was not in the real main event, right? The main event is not just the match that happens. The main event is what attracts people to the show. And the attraction that year was Roman Reigns versus Brock Lesnar. They probably didn't put Seth Rollins in there because they're like, why the hell would anyone want to watch this, right? But it was a nice surprise, nonetheless. So Seth Rollins wasn't really made in that WrestleMania. Roman Reigns obviously wasn't really made in that WrestleMania. I think the next WrestleMania, Roman Reigns loses to Brock Lesnar clean at WrestleMania. So he's not made in that one either, right? They give him a really slow burn. Roman Reigns is supposed to then be made when he beats Triple H, who is an established main eventer, right? However, for some reason, in my opinion, this didn't really work. Like, Roman Reigns didn't really feel, right? He didn't really feel like he was someone that was made, right? He shortly thereafter got leukemia, which is unfortunate, but that took him out of the equation, and now he's being reestablished again. But so let's leave him out of the equation altogether, right? Then Brock Lesnar jobs to Seth Rollins in a 5-match move, right? A 5-move match, I should say, cuts, right? So he jobs to Seth Rollins, the premise being that now Seth Rollins will be the star. He has the ball. Run with it, kid. Then we all know how that ends, right? The Fiend ruins something once again. And Seth Rollins is relegated to being a mid-carder, right? All of a sudden, he's feuding with Buddy Murphy and Rey Mysterio. It is what it is, you know? There's nothing wrong with that. Some people are just meant to be perpetual mid-carders with little pushes to the main event. These pushes to the main event, though, should be more like Dolph Ziggler's pushes to the championship, right? Not WrestleMania pushes. You see what I'm saying? Because you cannot sell a match, Seth Rollins versus Brock Lesnar, on Seth Rollins. The only selling point is Brock Lesnar versus a guy that might beat Brock Lesnar. It could be me. It could be Lars Henry. It could be the Red X. Any one of my fans. And it would sell the same, right? Lars Stanley versus Brock Lesnar. Probably Lars Stanley would beat the shit out of Seth Rollins. So let's be real, right? So it would be these types of scenarios, right? No one is buying the pay-per-view. No one is tuning in for Seth Rollins because he is not a main event caliber superstar, unfortunately. He might be a main eventer at Extreme Rules, but he's not a WrestleMania main eventer. Here's how you know. You're not going to see WrestleMania main event Daniel Bryan versus Seth Rollins. You just aren't. Even Seth Rollins versus Drew McIntyre. You're not going to see it. Drew McIntyre is another one of these guys. He's another guy that they tried to push on the back of Brock Lesnar, right? The match was not Drew McIntyre, the guy from 3MB versus Brock Lesnar. The match was Brock Lesnar will be here, and someone is probably going to beat him for the title. A new star will be established. This year, however, there is no current champion that holds the title, right? That is a main event level champion. Roman Reigns, they're going to force him in there because he is going to be their main event champion, right? And he is someone that has main event at WrestleMania. And you could argue him versus Undertaker, he was important in that as a WrestleMania main event. But I would personally argue that that's not the case. I would argue that the case is actually the opposite. That the reality is that Roman Reigns, right, was once again being pushed on the back of The Undertaker. The real premise there, the real draw of that WrestleMania, right, you can tell by the way it closed, is Undertaker is going to have his last match. That's why grown men in the stands were crying. They weren't crying because Roman Reigns beat Undertaker. They were crying because Undertaker lost and it's now over. You see what I'm saying? That's the key here, right? So Roman Reigns, you can make the argument that he is an established WrestleMania main eventer because he's been in several WrestleMania main events, but he just doesn't feel like one, right? This might be the time when he actually is established correctly. He goes in as champion and hopefully defends his title successfully against whoever the hell it's going to be, right? Obviously, the main title is always going to be the WWE title. The title that closes the show, at least, right? If it's the World Heavyweight title and it closes the show, then that's the main title. But almost always, the WWE title closes the show, right? Or, in recent years, it's been some sort of attraction match, right? Like you've had the Universal title go after, you know what I mean? Because you've had Brock Lesnar and Goldberg. But typically, the WWE title is the main title here. You understand me? So, that's just how it is, right? Now, they've spent a lot of time this year, right? Everything taken into consideration, pushing Drew McIntyre as a legitimate WrestleMania champion, right? And that's why Goldberg lost to him. This is a last-ditched effort to really establish him as a WrestleMania champion or someone that might one day, once again, main event WrestleMania. However, cucks, Edge won the Royal Rumble. Now, do you really think anyone wants to see Edge put over Drew McIntyre? Absolutely not. Edge is also on the comeback. He is kind of like The Rock was when he wrestled Cena. He's on the comeback, but he's a legend. So he needs to win. There is no way around it. Edge is going to win, almost certainly, right? The question then becomes, who is he going to beat? It makes no sense for him to beat Drew McIntyre because that's not really an accomplishment. Even though Drew McIntyre has had this incredible, quote-unquote, title reign, he doesn't feel like a challenge because he doesn't feel like a WrestleMania main eventer. Randy Orton does. And here's where the ball has been dropped. I predict that either tonight, right? I'm doing this video on Monday, motherfuckers. That's why I'm saying tonight. So I don't know if it's going to happen. Let's see if I predict the future, right? Either tonight or probably at Elimination Chamber, Drew McIntyre is going to lose the title. And he's going to lose the title in a type of way where the person that screws him over, let's say it's The Fiend, right? It might be The Fiend, actually, right? Let's say The Fiend comes back, screws Drew over, Randy Orton wins, right? Now The Fiend can go wrestle Drew McIntyre in a meaningless, pretend main event caliber match, and Randy Orton can have the championship and wrestle against Edge, right? Which is a legitimate championship-worthy main event match, right? At WrestleMania. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that it involves a 47-year-old man named Edge and Randy Orton, who instead of being in that spot, should be grooming other people to be in the spot. You see what I'm saying? This is the problem with WrestleMania. You need to really make a star. And a star cannot be made by feuding with Randy Orton 19 weeks in a row in meaningless matches, and before that feuding with Seth Rollins, right? A star needs to have personality, charisma. They need to have things, basically, that unfortunately Drew McIntyre does not possess, right? Look at JBL. He felt like a WrestleMania champion, even though he really wasn't. But the way that he was booked, the way he was pushed, was incredible, right? Now, people might say, well, Drew McIntyre has essentially been champion for the whole year, except for that 2 weeks that Randy Orton was champion. That's true. But that's not rare nowadays. Nowadays, AJ Styles can be WWE champion on SmackDown for over a year, and it means nothing. Boom, there he is on Raw, feuding with Ricochet and Humberto Carrillo. You see what I'm saying? The reality is this. The reason why JBL's push, unlike Drew's or AJ Styles' push, was successful is because back then, you were champion for like a month and a half. And JBL was champion for an unprecedented like 10 months, right? It's like, holy shit, how did this happen, right? That's why it was impressive. It would be the equivalent of, let's say, Seth Rollins wins the world title and is champion for 4 years. And then it doesn't matter if he sucks. It doesn't matter if he was a tag team jobber, right? He is established by virtue of knocking it out of the park, by overperforming everyone else in his role, right? So that's what's happening here. WWE realizes that they do not have any people that they are willing to make into superstars, right? To give them the personality. Like, God knows, maybe Cesaro, maybe Drew McIntyre have incredible personalities and insane levels of charisma that we are not being allowed to see, perhaps, right? Just because of the way they're booked. It's very possible, yeah? But the facts are what the facts are, and the facts are the facts. You dig? The fact is that Drew McIntyre does not feel like a champion. The fact is that once Drew McIntyre loses the title, it would not be inconceivable to never see him hold it again in his entire career. It is not inconceivable for Drew McIntyre to turn into a Dolph Ziggler despite his one-year title run. Imagine the amount of champions that we've had throughout the years that have been champion only once. There are a lot of people. And then there are people like AJ Styles who, despite being champion more than once, or Del Rio, like that level of guy, despite being champion more than once, kind of still feel like they've been champion only once. You know what I mean? It never really felt okay with Del Rio being a WrestleMania main eventer. Perfect example, actually. CM Punk, right? Longest title run conceivable, right? Out there fighting Undertaker. And for some reason, he never felt like a main eventer. That's why he was relegated to the co-main event. That's why other people like Cena and The Rock were in the main event. It's not some sort of conspiracy. It's because at the end of the day, nobody knows who CM Punk is. At the end of the day, nobody cares who Drew McIntyre is, right? So you have to put your eggs in the correct baskets come WrestleMania. That's just how it has to be, because this is WrestleMania. This is the time of the year where you showcase something, the showcase of the immortals. This is the one time, the one day out of the year where regular people that don't give a rat's ass about New Japan or even WWE Raw will watch wrestling. It is a phenomenon still. You dig? You understand me? That's how it works. So in order to capitalize on this phenomenon, the correct choices must be made. The choice that was made this year was to push and push and push and pretend that Drew McIntyre is ready for the spot. Then they realized, I suspect, I mean, I could be wrong. It could be Edge versus Drew McIntyre at WrestleMania, which would be obviously a mistake. I think everyone would agree, right? But the reality is this. You've spent the entire year pushing Drew McIntyre only for the real moment of his career, the one that matters, to be taken from him, right? It's not him winning it. Him winning it is step one. Him winning the title from Brock Lesnar is he has now been established. The work of this year of being pushed is step two. And step three, the final step, is him defending the title at WrestleMania. Even if he loses, that's fine. He loses, but he cements himself as a main eventer, as a guy who has main evented WrestleMania 2 years in a row. That's the real metric. A lot of people think the metric is to win the title and main event WrestleMania. No, the real metric is you must main event WrestleMania 2 years in a row consecutively. And those matches must mean something. You have to be the man in both of those matches, right? So for example, Roman Reigns has main evented WrestleMania several times, but I would argue that Roman Reigns has never been the man in those main events, right? There are a few feuds here and there, right, where both people are the man, right? Both people are the guy. They are both the A-side. So, for example, Kurt Angle, Brock Lesnar, you can make that argument, right? Even though Brock was new and Kurt was Kurt, they were both equally attractive to the mainstream viewer, right? That's the idea here. Shawn Michaels versus Cena. Both of these guys are equally attractive. or at least very attractive to the mainstream viewer as champions. You see what I'm saying? But Roman Reigns has never been that A guy. It's always been someone else and Roman Reigns. It's always been Undertaker and Roman Reigns, Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns. People that have been so much more established than Roman Reigns that it's not even worthy of putting them in the same sentence. Right? Do you see what I'm getting at? Same thing. Same thing. Braun Strowman has no business main eventing WrestleMania. The only way Braun Strowman wins a title at WrestleMania is if he beats someone like Goldberg. Otherwise, no one cares. If it's Braun Strowman versus Eric Rowan, no one cares. That's an undercard match. You see what I'm saying? That's the idea here, right? And Drew McIntyre, through no fault of his own, unfortunately, in my opinion, has failed to live up to the mantle that was given him, right? A one-year title reign, essentially, right? Which should have been a one-year continuous title reign. I thought that when he lost it to Randy Orton, that was the end of that. I was like, all right, Randy Orton was going to hold it now till WrestleMania and wrestle Edge. I guess they had other plans. I guess they wanted Randy Orton and Edge to interact at the Rumble. Who knows, right? Who knows and who cares? But the facts are what the facts are. People want to see superstars. And that is why every WrestleMania main event in the history of WrestleMania has involved a superstar of some sort. Typically, it's involved two superstars. But the fantasies that the neckbeards have had of like, maybe Nakamura wins the title, and then Daniel Bryan wins the Royal Rumble, and they meet at WrestleMania and tear the house down. No. That's never going to happen because neither of them are stars. You see what I'm saying? Neither of them are stars to carry it themselves. You might have Nakamura versus AJ Styles in the essential opening match, right? Not in the main event. That's not a main event. Not at all. It's not even close. That match could easily be for the Intercontinental title, and I'm sure it has been. You see what I'm saying? That is not a match that screams world title match to you. Cena versus The Rock will never be for the U.S. Championship. That is ridiculous. That is a preposterous proposition. When John Cena was U.S. Champion, he was out there wrestling Rusev and Sami Zayn. When it's time to wrestle The Rock, boom, one of them has to be champion. That's the only way it makes sense. Imagine Hulk Hogan wrestling Ric Flair for the European title, right? It doesn't make any sense. So that's the idea here, right? No new stars have been invented and created on purpose, I believe, but that comes at a cost. And the way that cost is tabulated and the way that it is paid off in the end is when you bring in an Edge and a Randy Orton and you say, now you guys, out of nowhere, go to the main event. Randy Orton, who's been like feuding with Bray Wyatt and who's been losing to Drew McIntyre for a year, is still a more attractive main event option than Drew McIntyre. Because Drew McIntyre has not been pushed correctly. He has not been given the correct storylines. This is a shortcoming of WWE. The way that they have, in my opinion, mismanaged Drew McIntyre. Drew McIntyre as a heel was fresh and interesting. He was a big, strong guy who's athletic, and it was beating the shit out of everybody, right? He was kind of what Lashley is now. Then he became like a jobber again. Then he became, all of a sudden, he's a face and he wins the Royal Rumble, right? He was not properly booked. He was not properly pushed to the main event. They just gave him the reins, just like they're giving it to Edge, except for, of course, Edge is a legend. And they expected him in the next year to magically be established as a main eventer. No. There are very few main event level wrestlers left in WWE. People like Randy Orton, and even Randy Orton is pushing it. He is one step away from not being that guy anymore. He's one loss to Ricochet away from, oh shit, maybe he's a mid-carder again, So that's what I'm saying, right? They haven't made any new stars. That's why there's this over-reliance on people like Randy Orton to carry the torch. That's why people like Bray Wyatt lose the title right before WrestleMania. That's why Drew McIntyre will lose the title right before WrestleMania. That's why CM Punk will lose the title right before WrestleMania. Because they have no faith in them. And they're justified in having no faith in them. Now, it may be their own fault, but that's neither here nor there. I'm just talking about the reality of the situation. The fact is the fact. And the fact is that this year's WrestleMania must be saved by Edge versus Orton. That feels like a big match. That is something I want to see. I no longer care about Drew McIntyre. I don't care if Drew McIntyre loses the title like I predict and then is put in a program with Lashley or The Fiend. And I like Lashley, but even with Lashley and The Fiend, that is a match that I will quickly skip or go take a piss during. You understand? It's not a match that attracts me as a viewer. And that's the thing. Goldberg, when I was watching the Royal Rumble, my girlfriend was like, this guy is old, this guy has no business being here. And I'm like, look, this guy is still Goldberg. He is attractive as a main eventer because of the fact that he's Goldberg. It speaks for itself. Res ipsa loquitur, as we say in the law. There's a different thing, but nonetheless, it means it speaks for itself. It speaks for itself. Goldberg is a main eventer. Roman Reigns kind of is. Drew McIntyre ain't. Right? It's as simple as that. He ain't. Right? That's why at any given moment last night during the Rumble, I would not be shocked if Brock Lesnar came in and won the Rumble. I would not be shocked. I was not shocked, for example. I mean, aside from the fact that it made no sense storyline-wise. But once Brock Lesnar came out at Money in the Bank and screwed Ali, I was like, of course he's going to screw Ali. Who the hell cares about Ali? You see what I'm saying? Nobody cares about Mustafa Ali. People want to see Brock Lesnar. Right? I watched the Yokozuna documentary, and one of the things that they talked about was how Hulk Hogan stole Yokozuna's moment at WrestleMania, right? Because Yokozuna beat Bret Hart through cheating, and then Hulk Hogan came and beat Yokozuna for the title immediately afterwards. And it showed like Roman Reigns and all of the Anoa'i family, the annoying family as I call them sometimes, right? And they all seem like nice people actually, so I shouldn't say that. But like, it showed them all being like, man, they screwed him, like it wasn't good. But they were all humble about it, don't get me wrong. But if you see the reaction of the fans when Hulk Hogan comes up, they lose their mind. The fans don't want to see Yokozuna. The fans don't want to see Bret Hart. The fans clearly wanted to see Hulk Hogan, right? Nobody cares about Yokozuna and Bret Hart. That's a perfect example of a main event back then that no one really cared about. They tried and they're like, oh, all right, this is not going to get the pop that we want. We don't want to end the show on the bad guy beating the good guy through cheating. We're going to end it with the real champ, the people's champ, Hulk Hogan. Same thing. This happens all the time. Same thing. They're like, oh, CM Punk is champion. What do we do? Oh, The Rock had interest in coming back. Why don't we have him destroy CM Punk's title run and have him be the champion because he's The Rock? And everyone in the board meeting looked at each other and they all nodded in agreement. Not one person said, well, what about CM Punk? No, no one said that. You know why? Because CM Punk isn't a main event WrestleMania talent. You dig? And with that, I'll see you guys tomorrow for the continuation of this year's Hater Mania, motherfuckers. Hater Mania 3, even though this is my second WrestleMania that I'm covering, and my channel's only been around for like a year and a few months. Doesn't matter, we're still at Hater Mania 3. Deal with it, cocks!